Welcome back. We are delighted to have Rachel Callander as our keynote speaker today. I had the pleasure of hearing Rachel speak at our clinical conference. She left an indelible impression on myself and everybody in the audience, and I'm so excited to hear her speak, and I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. With that, Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and it's so wonderful to be with you all. I'm actually beaming in from Western Australia, so it's 1 o'clock in the morning here, and I couldn't think of a better way or better reason to be up at 1 o'clock in the morning than hanging out with all of you. So it's lovely to be here. I am going to share a little bit of my story. I come to you with the parent perspective, and hopefully you'll connect with some of the story and find some things and some tools to take away with you in your own journeys. Alrighty, so here we go. When I was 15 years old, my high school art teacher told me that art could actually be a career. And this was the greatest news of my then life. And from that moment on, I was on my path to becoming a photographer. This was my great passion. And so in 2002, I ended up studying for a Bachelor of Fine Arts in a city called Dunedin in New Zealand. And I loved photographing tiny little things, things that people often overlooked, things that were discarded. I had this overarching theme that just kept following me around, and that inspired me. And this was the theme of finding beauty in brokenness. And so all these little pieces of the world became treasures that I love to discover and share with the world. And it was interesting, in my time at art school, people would say, "So Rach, when you graduate, are you going to become a wedding photographer?" And I said, "No, actually, I'm going to be a real artist. Thank you very much." I had no interest whatsoever in becoming a wedding photographer, until I was asked to photograph my cousin's wedding when I was still a student. And I found, to my horror and dismay, that I had just the most wonderful time doing this. And from that moment on, I decided, this is actually what I'm going to do. And so after I graduated, I set up my very own wedding and portrait photography business in Dunedin, New Zealand. And I called this business Callander Girl Photography. I thought that was quite clever of me, with my last name being Callander. But just after I opened my business, I discovered that up the road another business had opened. And it was quite different to the one that I was launching. And the strip club was up the road, and I found myself on the receiving end of some very strange late night phone calls. But all that aside, all marketing is good marketing, I guess. I was on my way and on my path of wedding photography, and I loved it. It was just so much fun and such an honor to be trusted to capture this day of a person's life, capturing all of the chaos and the emotion and the tension and the celebration, all of the pieces that are a wedding. And it was a huge honor to be part of it all. And my business was thriving, and I was being asked to travel around my country and even around the world to document this day for people. And things were going swimmingly, to be honest, and I was winning some awards and having a wonderful time. And then I found out that I was pregnant. And this, honestly, was one of the most traumatic days of my life. I never wanted children. I didn't really like children, if I'm completely honest with you. I didn't think that my particular personality was quite suited for parenthood. I was quite airy-fairy, arty mind, as my mother would say to me. I just rebelled against systems and structures and, the typical way of doing things. And I felt like parenthood would restrain me somehow. And I was terrified. I just wanted much more than the status quo, I guess. And so it took me a really long time to get used to this idea of this was now my new reality. This was my life. And it was difficult to let go of the vision that I had of freedom. But at the 20-week scan, we found out that this little bundle of impending doom was going to be a girl. And I started to kind of relax a little bit more when I knew that. And we decided to think about names and things. And the name Evie Amor came to my husband and I, which means that life is possible because of love. And we really let this kind of ethos and mentality sink in. And this was my new reality, I guess. I started to really enjoy the idea of this little human. We also found out at this 20-week scan that Evie had a little kidney issue. One of her kidneys wasn't draining properly, but the doctors were quite calm and confident and clear in their communication with us. And they said, she's going to be okay. She may need some surgery after she's born, but don't worry, everything will be fine. And then on the 30th of March 2008, Evie Amor Callander was born by caesarean birth in Dunedin Hospital. And my husband and I had the most incredible first few hours with her, just relishing being a family of 3 for the first time. And then when we tried to feed her, it was really difficult. She couldn't latch. She had a really small mouth. And so we tried to feed her by syringe. And as we did this, she started choking and vomiting and turned blue. And a nurse just grabbed her out of my arms and rushed her upstairs to the NICU ward. And then I didn't see Evie or hear about her or what was happening until the next morning when our midwife and the paediatrician came to see us. And they said that overnight they'd done some tests on Evie and that they had some really serious concerns about her. They told us that she had a condition that was incompatible with life. And they called this trisomy 18 or Edwards syndrome. They told us that she had skeletal anomalies, that she had multiple ventricular septal defects. They told us that it was highly unlikely that she would survive more than a year, and if she did, she'd have severe mental retardation. She had failure to thrive. There'd be global developmental delays. And these words, just this traumatic language and experience, and many of you would have had a diagnosis. You've got diagnosis stories, and I didn't even understand most of the words that were being spoken to me, but you feel them viscerally, like they hurt, because not only do you not understand them, but some of them are traumatic. Like they add more trauma to the trauma that you're already feeling. And so in this moment, as many of you know, your world just kind of falls out from under your feet, and you don't really understand what's normal anymore. Everything is just in chaos, and everything is at risk, and all of a sudden you don't even know who you are. I remember looking out the window of the hospital and not even really recognizing my own city. Everything just looked different because my whole world had changed. And it was difficult, and often with Evie's condition, her life hung in the balance so many times, and we were rushed to hospital by ambulance too many times to count. But I had fallen completely in love with this new little bundle in the world. And to me, I saw her as a new soul in the world, beautiful and full of potential. She wasn't just her diagnosis to me, and yes, it was difficult, but she had such spirit and bravery and tenacity, and I really loved being her mum. And she brought out in me a mother that I never knew existed. I didn't know that this person was inside of me, a person who could fight and advocate and endure incredibly difficult experiences again and again and again. She was a beautiful, beautiful piece of our life. And over time, she grew. She really did grow, and she thrived, and she kind of almost proved everybody wrong, I guess, just in the way that she did life. And in these photographs, she's around 2 years old. And it was around this time that I noticed that she was experiencing the world a little differently to other people. So, for example, often we had to drive on a particular piece of road to visit family, and we drove under a lot of electrical pylons. And every time we came up to these pylons, Evie would just start crying, and then would pass under, and then she'd stop crying. And it happened so much on this one little piece of road that I thought, there's something going on here, because it would wake her up at night sometimes, and it would just sort of come out of the blue, like a little switch went off. And I thought, I wonder, what's going on? And this happened when we went through electric sliding doors with Evie as well. She'd just start crying every time we came up to these doors. So I started wondering if she had an electromagnetic sensitivity that was completely unique to her. I couldn't feel it, but she clearly could. And so I kind of stuck on this concept. It's like, oh, she's like a baby Magneto of X-Men or something, she's got superpowers. And I loved this idea of using language in a new way to kind of highlight and elevate her personality, to reflect how I felt about her and how others felt about her. Because to me, this kind of superpower idea was, a bit lighthearted. But when I started to think about her more deeply, in the way that she was inspiring and encouraging elements of myself to come forward, and how she expressed herself and how she existed in the world, everything about her was really profound. Like, she evoked a level of love and care in people they hadn't experienced before. She laughed and expressed her happiness with her whole body, like she just flapped joy. She couldn't speak. She never spoke, but she could communicate everything that she needed or wanted with a single sound and the tone of her voice. She just had this fragility and a pure joy that drew people towards her. She was a really magnetic little human being. And so I referred to all of these things as Evie's superpowers, because what I was finding was I'd take Evie into the street, because I loved bringing her with me and sharing her with the world, because I loved her so much. And the first thing that people would ask me when they saw Evie was, what's wrong with your child? What's wrong with her? And so initially I'd kind of brace myself and I'd say, well, she's got partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6, and she's got multiple ventricular septal defects, and she can't walk and she can't talk and she doesn't eat solid food, and she, blah, 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 list off all of the diagnoses language. And that person would kind of glaze over, and then I'd glaze over. I hated sharing this kind of information about my child. And that, the person would walk away, and I felt like, I've really let Evie down here. This is horrible. But I didn't know how else to explain Evie. So I didn't believe there was anything wrong with her, but that was just the way society frames difference. Like, we're so afraid of difference, and we don't have the language to use for expressing difference. But once I had this language and mentality of superpowers as a way to share Evie's abilities and uniqueness, it really helped bridge that gap, that fear. So the next time someone asked me, what's wrong with your child? I just said, look, nothing is wrong with her. She actually has superpowers. And the other person looked at me like I was a bit strange, and they said, well, what do you mean? And then I got to reframe that whole conversation through the lens of ability and uniqueness and capability. I could say, Evie is so much fun. Like, she loves being on a beanbag. We communicate without words. We make up games together, and she knows how to play them. She's really funny. She really hates a lot of things. She hates my camera, which I thought was a bit mean of her, actually, being a photographer myself. But I could say I love being her mum. Yeah, it's hard sometimes. It's hard a lot of the time. But she makes it so worth it. Like, she's so easy to hang out with. She's 2.5. She's never had a tantrum in her life. Like, it's pretty superpowerish to me. And it was amazing how people responded to that language, and especially coming from me as the parent kind of leading that conversation. They'd look at her again and they'd say, oh, look at her, isn't she beautiful? Like, what deep sparkly eyes she has. She looks like a wise soul. And I got to say, yeah, she really is. And in that moment, because I described a human being, they saw a human being rather than a collection of failing body parts. And I think that's often where we land in this space, that we kind of, as parents, we've got feet in two worlds. We've got medical world foot, and on the other side, we're passionate parents who fiercely love our children. It's like, how do we keep bridging these worlds? And I think language is a way that we can do that. And so it's interesting, because I had this new language. I was feeling empowered and feeling excited. And I'm like, yeah, I've got this. I'm feeling good about life. But so often I was thrown back into kind of survival mode, or feeling hopeless and powerless based on the medical world. We had to fill out needs assessment forms. Those forms where you have to tick the boxes of all of the things your child can do or can't do in Evie's case. And I remember I had to fill out this 2-page document with a whole lot of questions, and I couldn't tick a single question on that 2-page document. Like, Evie wasn't doing any of the things a typical 2.5-year-old should be doing. And so I just hated the idea of handing in this form for the person at the other end to kind of think from my lack of ticks that here was a child that has no value, no purpose, she can't do anything, she's probably costing the system a lot of money, there's no return on investment here with this kid. These questions didn't speak to the value and the humanity of my child. And I know that these questions are for, gauging the level of support a family might need, financial or medical. But this form broke me. It just broke me with its lack of humanity, I guess. And so I kind of had a bit of a cry and then picked myself up afterwards and said to the health professionals that had triggered this form, I said, I hate this form. I don't want to hand it in. I suppose I have to, but if I have to, I'm going to hand in my own form as well. I want to make up my own form because this form just sucks. Like, it's just the worst. And so I made up my own form with questions that I could answer yes to and tick every single box to. And I'm going to share it here with you. And I called this form the Evie's Awesomeness form because she was completely awesome to me. And as you can see on this little document, some of the questions are pretty random and they wouldn't really make much sense to anyone other than a parent. But, questions like, can your child play Sleeping Tiger and other great games? And me being able to say, yes, Evie loves games and interacts by laughing, kicking, flapping, and moving close to us. Like, this is a game that Evie and I made up together. This is something that we enjoy doing together. Does your child laugh when objects fall near her face? Yeah, she did. And I have no idea what it was about that, but she loved it when we dropped cushions or soft toys near her. And she laughed when there were surprise loud noises. So I knew her quirks and I knew what she enjoyed. I knew how she experienced the world, and I loved being able to facilitate the things that she enjoyed. But again, these forms, they don't reflect the nuances of personality and character. Can your child do assisted pull-ups holding her head up? Yes, Evie does this very well using her dad to help her, and her record is 13 in a row. So cool. So I guess what I was doing with this form was I was measuring Evie against herself, because for so many parents out there, these forms and these documents, they're measuring sticks that their child is never, ever going to measure up to because they're not made for these children. These measuring sticks are just not applicable. They don't work as measurements, but this form became my benchmark because I could see how Evie was growing and developing and changing, and it was in her own time, in her own way. And I loved that. I think we all need to maybe evaluate the measuring sticks that we use for ourselves even, and for others. Maybe we need to be brave and just say, you know what, I'm not going to adopt the measuring stick of this societal rule today. I just don't want to, and I don't need it. I'm going to make up my own and measure myself against myself and my child against themselves. I think we stand in these two worlds, and this world, the parent world, is a world that often, it's so misunderstood. There's so much richness and meaning to be found in it if we get to actually share our voice and share our opinions and find the language to use in that space. And I've been sharing this awesomeness form with a number of health professionals around the world, and I know this slide is a bit tricky to read, but basically this is how a health professional is using it, and she's adopted the idea of the awesomeness form and is creating awesomeness reports. So every time she sees a child in her clinic, she's writing a couple of paragraphs that speak directly to the humanity of that child that she's seen in front of her. And she's writing things like, this child is really good at helping and noticing and cleaning up. Her smiles light up the room. She's got a big, huge grin and she radiates. You can't help but be happy. She already has a sense of humour and she brings joy to her family every day. So just something like that, and the pile of pieces of paper that we have as parents, I think is kind of like a beacon of hope in an often despairing space. Like, there's so much emphasis and energy going into things that aren't working, things that need to be fixed, trials and tribulations and all sorts of just stress. But a little paragraph where somebody outside of yourself as a parent or your family that says, your child is valuable and your child is interesting and they're worth working for. It's so cool. Like, this therapist says that since she's been developing these awesomeness reports and creating them, she enjoys her job more because she feels like she's able to help in a space that's deeply needed, that holistic human space. And parents responding to this health professional with trust, and there's a positive relationship built there because they're connecting on a human level. And it's so simple and so powerful. It's just a shift in language. Sadly, though, Evie's life wasn't a long life. We had an incredible 2.5 years with her. And every single day of those 2.5 years, she was completely compatible with life. It just wasn't for as long as we might have hoped. But in this short yet remarkable little life, like, she's inspired a dream that has become her legacy, I guess. And in the course of 6 years or so, I've created 2 books, one with my beautiful partner who's actually sitting beside me, Superpower Baby Project and Superpower Kids. And they're both photographic art books that celebrate the lives and abilities of children living with a whole range of different chromosomal and genetic conditions. And they're full of photographs and they're full of life. And the children in the books they shine back at you just with their life and their passion and their joy. And the stories that the parents have shared with us are in there as well. And they're just they're saying things like, it is really hard, but we love our children and they've given us a purpose and a meaning, and we couldn't be happier with the progress that they're making. And it was interesting when I was photographing these children, there were themes that emerged in the way that the parents were talking about their children. They constantly said things like, this child is bringing out perseverance and deep empathy and kindness in us, and we understand what unconditional love is now, and we're advocates, and we never knew that we had this ability, we never knew that we could be so strong. And they were all so proud of their children, and the language they were using was so empowering and uplifting, which is in such contrast to the language of difference and disability that we use, maybe because of the medical world. We use words to describe disability or difference with words like retarded or dysmorphic, mutated or abnormal and disabled. And to me, these words, they're so subtractive and so negative and deficit focused, and they often take potential and ability away, because that often is the thing that we focus on, the lack. But there's so much more to a human than their diagnosis. You can't be diagnosed with your identity. Your diagnosis can form part of that identity, but it's not the whole. There's so much else within that needs to be explored and expressed as well. This was a document that was given to me when Evie was born, because the doctors actually hadn't heard of or seen her particular chromosome condition. So she didn't end up having trisomy 18. She had something even rarer. She had partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6, which is a deletion and a duplication of 2 different chromosomes. And so this isn't quite that, but the doctor said, here, take this, read this. This is basically your life. This is as close as we can get to how we can explain what life is going to look like with your child. And this form was just horrific. I don't think it should have been given to me. I think the doctors were just doing their best and trying their hardest to give me as much information as they possibly could, but it wasn't written for a parent. And this traumatized me instead of helping me. I was looking for an anchor, any point of connection. And I just fell through a rabbit hole of despair, and I hated this form. I didn't understand 80% of the words, and the ones I did actually truly terrified me. And I'm going to read you just a few of the words that I did understand. And I invite you, if you have a pen in your hand, or you might even draw it imaginarily in your head, but imagine drawing what you hear me say, the words that you hear me speak, and see what you might come up with at the end. The nose is long, fleshy, slightly beaked. The eyes are deep-seated. The mouth is small and triangular. The chin is small and receding. The ears are relatively excessively large and square with abnormal folding. The neck is short with redundant skin folds. The trunk is asymmetric, the right side being more prominent. The extremities are thin and the fingers and toes unusually long and thin. She has a weak, hoarse cry. The tone is poor. She has stereotypical writhing movements of the arms and legs in an avoidance manner. I didn't understand any of the other words that we used, but in your imaginary or real drawing, do you have some kind of elephant, pterodactyl, bird creature thing like on your piece of paper? Would you have anything at all resembling a human girl? I don't know. Maybe if you're a really good artist, maybe. But this form described in such negative detail the features that I loved so much about my child. Like, I adored Evie's deep, sparkly eyes and her delicate fairy fingers. The medical term for her fingers, because they were so long and thin, is arachnodactyly, which literally translates to spider hands. And I'm terrified of spiders. And now that I live in Australia, it's awful. Like, there's spiders everywhere. It's horrible. New Zealand has no spiders. Honestly, it's so good. But arachnodactyly, ugh, I hated that term. Like, to me, they were fairy fingers, delicate and small, and I loved that. And I understand, and it's really tricky. Like, the language we use really does shape our landscape. And it can create fear and chaos and trauma, or it can empower and elevate. And so over the years, I've been really interested in the power of language, and I've been talking with health professionals, especially at diagnosis, like how they can use language in a way that is clear, kind, and can be understood, because it's often not. And it's not just in the medical world, it's often the language we use or is used around us from people who don't understand our experience. And then they assume things. So I've developed this tool, the Health Language Matrix. And so we've got the 4 quadrants. And this first quadrant, oopsies, can you do that? Thank you. In the first quadrant, we've got the patronizing language. And it comes from a positive place. It's positive jargon, I guess we call it. It's kind of cliche language. It's a bit fluffy. It means well, and that's the thing I hope you hear me say. It means well. It just doesn't know how to connect, but it's trying to. So often parents will hear words like, or phrases like, God only gives special kids to special parents. And on the outset, that's quite a nice thing to have said over you, but often in this space, you're feeling not very special. A lot of the time you're exhausted, everything's at risk, you're chaotic, everything is like you're just right at the end of your coping capacity. Like, you just need somebody to help you, but you don't even know what to ask for. Like, you're right on the edge of everything. It's a really difficult space to be. Or you might hear things like, after Evie died, I got a lot of, at least you had 2.5 years with her. And it's like, 1,000 years is never long enough when you love someone so hard. It's not that. It's not at least. It's always difficult. And I think this kind of language tries to patch over a gap in experience that we don't know how to talk about. And a lot of damage can actually be done in this space, even though it's coming from a really good place. I think there's a lot of work that can be done in this space on how do we engage with people who are going through difficult experiences, especially if they're different from our own. And then down here in the jargon negative quadrant, this is just where a lot of medical language fits anyway. And this is confusing, so confusing. All of the acronyms and the big Latin words, we don't connect with this language. We don't understand it. Like, people spend 7 years learning medical language, and regular person language just doesn't sound like that, and it takes a really long time to learn these big fancy words. And when somebody doesn't understand, they can't connect to their experience, and it adds trauma. And then we have the destructive language, the informative negative, and this is words that I think take away that humanity of a person. Words like retarded, incompatible with life, mutated, abnormal, disabled. Like, retarded is one that, I mean, this word isn't even acceptable socially even now. Like, it's used to really hurt somebody. It's really difficult. And then there is hope. There is the positive, informative quadrant, the empowering language. And this isn't to kind of fluff over anything, but it's kind and it's clear, and it makes sure that the person has understood what's happening, especially at diagnosis. It kind of reframes some of that other language, you know. So instead of saying something like incompatible with life, the phrase would be life limiting. And I know that that's being used more widely these days, like life is still the focus then. And it's just a subtle shift. And even I've had friends who have been given a diagnosis of Down syndrome for their children. And, you know, there's often a 50% chance that their child is going to be a boy or a girl, but a 1 in 200 risk of Down syndrome. So the chance and risk flip is really interesting as well. Already, that word risk kind of puts alarm bells in a person's head and kind of makes you afraid before you've even met the child. So it's just subtle language can shift how we perceive the future and our reality. And I'm hoping we can be together and talk more about this through workshops and things where we unpack all of this stuff in more detail and talk about some more examples and ideas that we can use in these spaces. But we don't have that much time today, so I'm going to keep going. It asks more questions. It doesn't assume anything. So these questions are 4 that I've kind of created that I think really get to the heart of humanity as quickly and as effectively as possible. And if you're a parent in this space listening, I encourage you to deeply think about answering these questions for yourself. Just even in your own time, maybe take a screenshot or write them down or something. But when you think about what you're proud of in your child and in yourself, especially in yourself in the space, like what have you endured? What are you proud of, what you've done and what you've seen in your life and in your child? Think about capability. Think about growth and change. And then what do you hope for? Like, what are you working towards as a family, as a parent for your child? Like, what are you working towards? And can you share that with your health professionals and your team and your family so everyone sort of knows where you're going and can help support you and gather around you in that journey? What are you afraid of? And I know this is a really confronting question. Maybe even start with what you're concerned about or what you're worried about. But the thing is, when we invite fear into the space and when we can kind of look at it and ask it, you know, what is it that I'm afraid of? Maybe I can learn something from this fear. Maybe I won't run away from it and face it and see what happens. It's quite powerful what you might find. And if you can be brave enough to acknowledge it and then share that with somebody else, it means then that you're breaking down those barriers between worlds again, and the support and help that you need might be able to be delivered directly to those places. And then what do you need? And especially the mums, like, it's really difficult to answer this because you don't even know how to ask for help. There's often a mentality of you just have to do it all alone, and it's just simply not true. It's not possible. And asking for help isn't a form of weakness. It's incredibly brave and courageous. But even just stopping and thinking for a minute, what do I need right now? It's a really powerful exercise. So I encourage you to find some space and find some time and sit with these questions for yourself. Because what we're finding is this is just a little tool. There's a spectrum of experiences, and it's not like you kind of go up the ladder from the bottom to the top and then all is well. You might find that you are in one space one day and in another space another day. But often when you receive a diagnosis or you're living this life of caring for a person with multiple needs and medically fragile, you're often in a space of despair. And I liken this as a metaphor. It's like, as a photographer, it's like you can't even see anything. Like the image that you've created or that you see is just darkness. It's despairing. It seems like there's no hope. It's all dark. And I hope that not many of you are in that space right now, but if you are, I encourage you to reach out and find some support. Often many of us are in survival mode, and that's just kind of where we end up. We're just kind of fighting another day, another day, another day. Lists and ticks and check boxes and medical appointments are the reality, and it just feels like we're just surviving. And then there's an acceptance when you can kind of come to terms with this new reality, and maybe you have got some support. And then kind of above the line is when you sort of can think about maybe a different future, or maybe you're settling into a new reality and maybe you have got some support and you're sort of feeling a bit stronger. You have an anticipation that maybe things are going to be okay, or things are okay. And then you step into an identity that you're proud of. You're like, I'm proud of my child. I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of my family. This is actually not what I expected or what I wanted, but this is my life, and that's okay. And I'm part of a community that I'm really excited by. Like, I've got people that understand me. And then in the dignity space, that's kind of where you deeply feel so proud of yourself and your child that you almost kind of throw away societal norms. You're like, you know what, this is valid. This experience needs advocacy, and I'm energized by the thought of kind of fighting not only for my own child but for others. And then kind of a few levels up, there's a legacy piece, and that's probably far too far away to think about. And we have no control over our legacy, really. It's not up to us to decide what our legacy is. Like, it just simply becomes as we live and grow. But I just wanted to leave this here with you just as an idea of, if you could put yourself on this ladder today, which rung would you circle? And then maybe even share that with others, and share that with people close to you, so they have an idea of what your reality is like. Use some language around it. Answer those questions. You know, what are you proud of? What do you hope for? What are you afraid of? What do you need? Maybe see what happens and what comes out. I know we're right near the end of time, and I share this photo with you just as I'm wrapping up. This is my favorite image in the world, and I guess this speaks to me of dignity. This is the beautiful version of my biggest fear, I guess. This is me scattering the ashes of Evie at the bottom of Mount Aoraki, Lake Pukaki in New Zealand. It's the most magical place. And to me, this is an image of hope and freedom and gratitude and wonder and amazement. And I love this image, and I was deathly afraid every single day of her life. You know, I planned her funeral before she'd even died, just because I knew that it was coming. But this is the other side of that. Like, can you imagine the most beautiful version of your fear? And that might be a really, really big question and a big, hard thing to even think about, but I just encourage you to start entertaining the thought that maybe there is a beautiful version of your fear out there. All right, I think I'm going to throw back to the crew in the studio, and then we'll see what happens after that. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was absolutely wonderful, and I know so many families appreciated you coming on and speaking, and I know Pat Furlong would love to pick up the conversation here. We were lucky enough to meet you through Pat. Pat found you, and we all considered it a gift, and thank you so much for being our keynote speaker, and I want to pass this now to Pat.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. I think I could stay with you all day and just talk. I met Rachel a couple years back at a meeting, and I was speaking and she was speaking, and then we each had our own sort of agenda to go to. Once Rachel spoke, I didn't want to do my agenda. I wanted to go with Rachel. So I didn't think that would work. And I said, can I just not go do my stuff and go with Rachel? And no one seemed to think that was a great idea. So Rachel came to our Healthcare Professional Summit this year, and I too, I've always been interested in language and how things are described. And I've always been interested in how people use language. And I think that all of us faced with the diagnosis of Duchenne hear dystrophin and all of these words that are complicated, right? And I hear parents saying to me, it takes years before this sinks into my brain about what all this is, the chromosomes of this, the dystrophin expression, the AAV, the promoter, the this, the that, and we get so tangled up in this. And sometimes we spend 24/7 online looking for stuff. And I had 2 boys with Duchenne long ago, and I was doing exactly that, right? I was immersing myself in everything. And one day my little son, Patrick, said to me, "Who needs fixing, you or me?" And so it was sort of that stark reality that I'm still here. I want to be valued. I want you to see me. And so I think your words, what are you afraid of? I think that's really hard, don't you? I mean, what would you have said if you take yourself back to when Evie was first diagnosed? What were you afraid of?
Yeah, ultimately, I was afraid of death. I was constantly afraid of death and not coping and not surviving death. And I think it's a big issue. And I know that that's probably at the heart of a lot of fears for parents. And it gets wrapped up with a whole lot of other things. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I'm not brave enough? What if I don't survive this? What happens to my family? There's so many questions around fear and being afraid. And I think what I ended up doing was I really learned to appreciate each day. And I don't want that to sound patronizing and fluffy, because death is just the worst. It's horrible. But it isn't the end. That's what I've learned about death. I never imagined that I would survive after Evie died. And there was a period where it was just absolutely horrific. It was awful. But it was a journey and a process. And with help and love and support, I have that beautiful photograph of death. And I think maybe that's what we need to understand, and we need to talk about death more, I think, especially in a community of love and support, especially when there are experiences that are so connected and potentially similar. How do we support those who are constantly afraid of death? And to see it as a really painful part of life that can end up being beautiful. Even though I miss Evie every day, but it doesn't hurt me anymore. And I think that's worth holding on to as well.
I think so. So Rachel, when Evie was here, those 2 years that you had her, and I assume that she had multiple medical complicated things happen. How did you say out loud to the healthcare professionals what you were afraid of? Who did you talk to? When they were talking about all of the medical management of whatever Evie was going through at the time and the emergencies that you must have experienced.
Yeah.
What would have been different for you? How did you manage through that? And what would you have preferred, or what would have been more helpful than this is an emergency and she may aspirate and she may do, all of those scary things? What would have been more beneficial?
Really good question, Pat. And I think when I was able to articulate just exactly what I was afraid of, it was really quite powerful. And I did this with my health professionals at one point, because we were always in hospital and in the ambulance, because Evie would aspirate a lot. She'd choke and vomit and just stop breathing, just often when she'd be drinking her food. And it was a real issue. And we spent so much time in hospital that she kept getting sick and she didn't grow. And it was just a kind of a cycle of not good experiences. So when I said to her, I said to my health professionals, I'm so afraid of her choking and aspirating. What if I fall asleep? I can't cope. What if it's all my fault? And, there's a lot of guilt that we carry as parents. They came alongside me and they said, well, look, we'll do everything we can to support you. And the thing we'll do is we're going to upskill you and give you 2 pieces of equipment, a sucker machine and an oxygen machine. And so they actually practically helped me with my fear. So we were given these 2 pieces of equipment, and it meant that I could manage Evie's aspirating and choking at home initially it was just to buy us a few more minutes while the ambulance was coming, but having these 2 pieces of equipment actually kept us out of hospital 9 times out of 10. So I felt like they supported me in my fear. They took me seriously enough to upskill me and give me access to this incredible equipment. So it was just simple little things like that. And there was one time, it was a beautiful piece of communication. There was a time when Evie was really sick in a hospital, and they decided they might need to give her a tracheostomy. But the doctor, this chief of surgery, said, just because we can do these things doesn't mean that we should. And I'm really interested to know what you value and what quality of life looks like. We had all of these conversations about quality of life and values of our family and what was reasonable for Evie and our perspective. So I think it's really important when health professionals can have a more holistic conversation around what is it that you care about, and we will help facilitate that. And so I think that's where those other questions come, like, what do you hope for? Like, I just wanted Evie to have as much of a pain-free life as she could for however long that was. So yeah, it's beautiful when people can put a family's values on the table as well as their scalpel, I guess,
Yeah, no, I totally think it's about value. I know that, we are lucky enough to have many clinical trials going on that are very exciting, and lots of time and blood, sweat, and tears, to be honest, from these young men to be participating in trials as well. And then we get to approvals, and often those approvals are expensive. And so then you have someone making a value judgment about you deserve it or not, based on whatever form I'm looking at and whatever boxes you are able or unable to check. And I think that if we could I agree with you about healthcare professionals, but I think it goes so far beyond that. It also goes to our insurers and our payers and our schools, to judge someone on you can do these things or you can't do these things, and therefore you get or don't get, or I'm going to put you in this position, right?
Exactly.
Have you thought about all of those different areas, the schools, the payers, the insurers, the healthcare professionals? Are you working in all those areas? And how do you think about those people? I don't mean those people. I didn't mean it, those people. You know what I mean? That segment.
Yeah. It is, and I think it is across the whole of society. Like, we don't know how to deal with people that are different from us because we assume that they don't have value because they don't do the things that a normal person should do. And you're right. And I love talking to educators and teachers especially, and this idea of superpowers, and even the language of superpowers, it can be kind of, I don't know, it's still a little bit fluffy for me, even though I like it. But it's about seeing the ability in ways that are not typical. It's like, just because the child can't walk or talk or whatever else the checkbox is measuring, there's so much more to a person than those things. Like, there's so much more life and ability and things that we can learn and how we can interact with the world. Like, the world has just not been built to accommodate everybody, and I think that that's the missing piece. Like, so the insurers and the payers, and they're all part of it, but it's the architects and the designers and the city designers and the accessibility people and the transport. Like, it's just our overarching psyche of we don't know what to do with difference, so therefore we will exclude because it's a bit easier. I think that's the psyche, and I think the more that parents and health professionals can become allies and really connect on the diversity and the incredible value of a human life. Like, no matter what it looks like or what it can do, like, there's so much potential in there, and there's so much worthy of celebration and learning. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I always get amused of even today in the midst of the pandemic, let's get back to normal. And I keep saying to myself, so what's that supposed to look like? I mean, what's normal, and what's a normal person, and what do they do? Because I don't think I know any normal people, right? I know lots of amazing people, but not any normal people. So
I don't know why we have this obsession with trying to be normal, and even, getting back to normal was what we're doing I think we weren't doing that great anyway. I think this is an opportunity to learn and grow and become and evolve and change and shift and become more accepting, more open, more human. I think we have this such narrow idea of what normal is. We just need to stretch it, flatten the curve of what our normal kind of looks like. And I think we'd be amazed at the interesting ways that we could exist in the world that are more accepting and sustainable and more beautiful and more, I guess, meaningful than we ever could have imagined. Because the parents are living it day to day, but they're fighting a system that is just set up for exclusion, and I hate that. It's not fair.
It isn't fair. It certainly isn't fair. So I'm going to ask you, and you're allowed to say I'm not answering your questions, but when we have but I'll ask it anyway, and then you can tell me. When we have a child with a diagnosis that is life-limiting or certainly described as progressive and debilitating, parents or partners who get these diagnoses are grieving, right? Because they have to find their way through it. And it takes, I think I'll be honest with you and say, before I could say the word Duchenne out loud it probably was a year or so before I could roll it off my tongue and say anything. And I used to get frustrated with my father, who would introduce me as, here's my daughter and she has 2 sons with Duchenne. And I wasn't even used to the word, right? So my question for you, Rachel, is you were married at the time. How did you grieve differently? How did you communicate? What did that look like, and how did you find your way together or agree to that together wasn't useful?
That is a really good question, Pat. I love that we're talking about this. I think it needs to be asked more often. We grieved very differently, my husband and I think I was more accepting, and I learned the language as quickly as I could because I wanted to understand. But I think my husband, Sam, found it so confronting, and he was also working as well. So I was at home with Evie a lot, so I got to see her and interact with her more and interact with the health professionals, but he was working and supporting us. So I have a feeling that he probably felt extremely isolated and didn't know how to talk about it. And so I'm kind of thinking back, I really am grieving for Sam's experience, because I think he didn't really even get a chance to share what he was feeling, because I'm so emotional and I'm very open with how I'm feeling. And I think that I didn't maybe allow space for him to grieve. And I remember after Evie died, he came and he wanted a hug from me. And I was just so broken and so upset that I couldn't watch his grief. And I said, I can't right now. I can't watch you grieve while I'm also holding my own. And so I think I did a lot of damage to Sam in that moment, because I essentially was saying, I can't handle your pain. And so he just learned to shut it off. He couldn't express it with me. So we couldn't talk about it. And it was really difficult. And we're divorced now. And it wasn't that there was a lot of other things going on, but I know that our communication together, we couldn't communicate well. And it was so difficult. And grief is so nuanced, and it's not a linear journey either. It's just crazy. It's all over the place. One day, like even now, like Evie's been gone 10 years and I'm fine. And then there are tiny little things, triggers, and then I'm a mess again. And it's just crazy. And I feel like I'm right back at the start, or I have dreams and I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's horrific. But I think communication is so important, and allowing space, and counseling. Oh my goodness, that would have been good. I think my husband and I, we didn't go to counselling, and I think, what were we thinking? We needed all of the help that we could get, but I don't know.
It's what you're afraid of, isn't it?
It's what you're afraid of, yeah.
Yeah, I think communication is so, it's so hard when you're trying to get used to a word, a diagnosis, to be able to communicate to someone else who's on an equal path. Not a different path, but the same, in terms of the same goal of getting used to this and being able to say it out loud. How do you get there? How do you bridge the communication when it feels so frightening, right? Because I didn't want to fall apart. I wanted to be strong and look like I could manage this, when I couldn't at all. Right? But I couldn't say it out loud because it made me feel weak. And I think that's part of it as well. Right?
Yep, I know. And sometimes I learned that, the world won't fall over if you fall over. It's I think especially the parents, they've got to hold it all together for everybody else. But I'm like, no, they're the ones that really need to be allowed to fall apart right now and have people to help them get back up. Like you hold everything together for everyone else, and then you realize that there's nothing left in the tank, and then you have a massive it's so difficult, and then you feel like you're not even allowed to anymore because it would just destroy everything that you've worked so hard to build up. And it's just a tangle, the mess. But counseling and support, and I think just honesty and talking about fears is a really confronting thing, but I think it's one of the most needed when we're talking about communication.
But how can you trust, and who do you trust to tell what you're most afraid of? How do you find that person?
I think it comes from, it's a person that has a shared humanity with you, like someone you can talk about your experience with, and you can say, I need to share things about my experience that are going to be difficult to hear, but I need you to hear them anyway. Maybe don't even talk, you don't even need to use words, because that's the thing. Like sometimes communication, the no words is really powerful. Like a parent just needs to be able to talk. And maybe it's just about setting up the boundaries. What do you need from, that's another question. I just need to be able to talk my story, share my world, share my truth, and have no one judge it or question it. I just need to talk about it. Maybe if you can find a person that will let you do that or let you be that. A close friend, a family member, even a health professional, a counsellor, definitely.
I think you have to find someone or some people. I know social media is a place where people are, but I don't find it is the best or the place where the trust can be held for your honest self, right? I think we have to find those persons or people to hold our trust.
Definitely. And, you've got a community around you now. Maybe there's a few people, there's I'm imagining there are pockets that when you meet together that people gravitate towards each other and there are deep friendships made. Maybe it's about kind of utilizing those relationships that are existing or being forged right now in the space because you understand each other. This Duchenne community. Find people.
We are certainly blessed in the Duchenne community. It's a big one. It's full of it's full of us, right? The crazy aunts and uncles, the goofy people, the people that are falling apart, the people that are standing up, and everyone takes turns being crazy, standing up and sitting down and falling apart. And I think to that end, it's a loving community.
Yeah, and that's life. I think we strive so much for normal and, to ride a straight, smooth road. It doesn't exist. Life isn't like that. And I think the more we can accept that and accept that it's going to be bumpy and difficult, I think the better off we'll end up being if we can kind of go, all right, here we go, hold on, brace for impact. But you're in it together with a community and with people that love and support you.
Yeah. Rachel, first of all, I love you. I love seeing your face. I love talking to you. I hope you'll do some more with us. We want to see you in person, but until then, we'll do some workshops. And thank you for what you've given to us and given to so many people. I want you to talk to everyone because I think we all have magic and I think we all have superpowers and I think to let them come through, right?
Yes, I agree. And thank you so much for having me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. Well done. And much love. Mwah.
We love you. And I love your superpowers. We'll see you soon. Back to you, Ryan and Eric. Thank you.